All right, we're going to get started. I realize that some people are still coming into the room, but I want to just make sure that we use the time that we have to talk about Professor Liang's brilliant first book, Identity Capitalists. I'd like to welcome you to our final speaker series event for the academic year for the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. My name is Kenji Yoshino, and I'm the faculty director of the center. I would like to begin by thanking the wonderful sponsors of our speaker series. So the list grows ever longer. So let me try to do this expeditiously while also honoring the people who are kind enough to sponsor events like these. We have Cleary Gottlieb, Cravath, Davis Polk, DLA Piper, Fried Frank, Latham and Watkins, Morgan Stanley, Paul Weiss, Sullivan and Cromwell, Wachtell Lipton, Weil Gotschall, and White and Case. For this event, I'm more than delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Nancy Liang. Professor Liang is a professor of law in the William M. Beanie Memorial Research Chair and the director of the Constitutional Rights and Remedies Program at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. She is the author of over 40 law review articles and essays on constitutional rights and remedies, criminal procedure, anti-discrimination law, law and culture, and judicial decision-making. Her first book, Identity Capitalists, was published by Stanford University Press in 2021. And I should say that I had the honor of blurbing this book, and I said that the term identity capitalism should take its place alongside white fragility and unconscious bias as a permanent part of our vernacular of civil and human rights. And I hope that I can prove that case to you over this conversation. Getting back to Professor Liang's bio, she's a recipient of numerous awards and honors, including the University of Denver Distinguished Scholar Award given to one faculty member each year. Professor Liang graduated magna cum laude from Northwestern University before attending Stanford Law School, where she graduated with distinction. After earning her law degree, she clerked for Judge Kermit Lipez of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit. I'm thrilled to welcome her to NYU Law. Towards the end of today's program, I'll open up for Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So, Professor Liang, welcome. We're so happy to have you here. And I just want to start by asking you, what is identity capitalism, this new term that we're all going to hammer into the vernacular after this session?
Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for having me here today. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank both Professor Yoshino and the New York University Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging for giving me this opportunity to talk about my book. It's a pleasure and my honor to be here. And I really appreciate having this forum for my ideas. So identity capitalism. Well, what I'm interested in doing in my research is looking at how we value identity, and in particular, how members of in-groups, and by in-groups, the way I'm using that term refers to groups that are powerful or dominant in society, like white people, men, straight people, people who are wealthy, how members of those in-groups gain value from out-group identity. And so the process by which in-groups use out-group identity to benefit the in-group is a process that I've coined the term identity capitalism to describe. And so a member of an in-group, whether it's an individual person or let's say a predominantly white or predominantly male or predominantly white male institution that uses out-group identity to benefit itself, either an individual or an institution would be an identity capitalist.
Great. So could you give us some examples of that? Because you say in your book that universities do this, workplaces do it, politicians do it, judges do it, even ordinary people do it in our day-to-day lives. And so part of the force of this is that it names a phenomenon that we all engage in. As you say, we are all identity capitalists right now. So just to sort of land the plane on this concept, can you just give us a few examples? If you don't mind, I found that opening story just harrowing and riveting. So I think our listeners might enjoy that one as well. Enjoy, I'm picking my words sort of maladroitly here because enjoy is probably not the right word, but riveting, I should say.
Yeah, so I think that a good entry point into the concept of identity capitalism for a lot of people is in the context of friendship. And the story that you're referring to is something that happened to me a number of years ago when I was at the wedding of a friend of mine from college, or somebody who I had been friends with in college, I think might be a more accurate way of describing it. And I had actually been a little bit surprised to get an invitation to this wedding because this was somebody I'd kept in touch with on social media, but not necessarily somebody who I still considered myself close to. But I got the invitation and ended up going. And there was a moment at the reception where I was chatting with my friend. It's a beautiful ceremony, beautiful reception. So I was chatting with my friend, and she said to me, "I'm so glad that you could make it, because if you hadn't been able to attend, everyone here would have been white." And I think that that was the time that I first named this concept of identity capitalism to myself. Because what really struck me about her comment is that I wasn't there just in my capacity as her friend. I was also serving another function. I mean, I think we could even say that I was part of the color scheme, just like the tablecloths and the flower arrangements, right? Like I was actually there in the capacity of her friend of color. And this was an opportunity not only to see me, her long lost friend from college, but also perhaps to demonstrate to the other people at the wedding that she had at least a minimally diverse friend group. And so I think to expand this example more broadly, I would guess that many folks, maybe everybody who's gathered here today, has heard somebody in their life say something like, "Well, I can't be racist because I have a Black / Asian American / Latino friend," or something like that. So I think that this is something that comes up quite a bit in talking about friendships. We also see this come up in the context of institutions, when an institution is trying to demonstrate that it is diverse in a way that promotes the institution's reputation. And this takes place in a lot of different ways. In the book, I actually pull together many examples of what I call racial Photoshop, meaning situations in which an institution, usually a predominantly white institution, has found some photos of people of color who might or might not actually be students at the institution, and photoshopped those photographs into the school's promotional materials. We see this as well with other institutions like businesses, every big business from Walmart to Amazon to FedEx. I mean, name your business, right? They've got a link on the web page labeled something like diversity or diversity, equity, and inclusion that takes you to a page full of nice statements about diversity and almost inevitably photos of racially diverse people, as well as people who are diverse along other lines of identity. So there are many examples in realms far beyond education and business and friendship, but I hope that helps to start to illustrate some of the ways that identity capitalism can take place.
Absolutely. And as we were chatting about before we went on, my favorite example of this is a photo that you have in your book where there's the same, Black gentleman, right, who is, appears twice in a photograph. So you say they liked him so much they had him back, right, in the same photograph. So he's like mirror image on both sides of the photograph, which is just astonishing, given that anyone who looks at the photograph carefully can just be like, well, wait a minute, something's not right here in the most kind of obvious sense, as opposed to the more, subtle and deeper sense that you're talking about, Professor. I think at this point, I just need to cop to the fact that, this book really made me squirm at so many different intervals, right? Because as you say, we're all identity capitalists. So I would say myself, my center, NYU, all of the organizations that sponsor us, we all feel like this incredible hydraulic pressure to engage in this form of identity capitalism in order to, signal that we're inclusive organization. So I'm going to give you some questions and reactions that I hope don't strike you as overly defensive, but to ask you to help me through some quandaries that I had as I was reading your work. So my first kind of reaction, this is all in the vein of, are there good forms of this? Are there kind of benign forms of identity capitalism, or do we really have to check ourselves whenever we feel this impulse? So I thought of, Claude Steele's experiment in his, famous book, Whistling Vivaldi, where he said, if you actually show individuals who are minorities, photographs that include them as opposed to photographs they don't, they'll feel more warmly towards the organization that has the brochure that includes them. So that's, I think, just common sense and something that we just know it's a kind of you can't be what you can't see kind of thing of imagining your way into an institution. So let's take one of these organizations that has these brochures where they Photoshop somebody in even. But their motivation in doing that is to say, we know we're not good at this. We know that we need more diverse representation. And one of the ways to send that friendliness cue is to have this brochure. So is the fact that, and let's take the extreme case just to make sure that I'm not being too easy on myself. Like, let's take the extreme case of I Photoshop somebody in. So I know I've done a bad, inauthentic thing from the organization's perspective, but I'm doing it out of the good motive to actually increase the reality, right, of the diversity within the organization. Is that just, out and out terrible because it's false advertising and unethical, or is there anything redeeming about the impulse behind it?
So I think the short answer is that not all identity capitalism is created equal. And I think even the school at the far end of the continuum, perhaps, that has done some photoshopping, maybe not even of a person who's actually a student at the school. So something that is that extra level of inauthentic may still be operating from a good place, right? Like they may have good intentions. And I would even go so far as to say that doing that could have some benefits if perhaps somebody out there sees a photo of a person of color in a school's admissions brochure and it helps them to imagine themselves at the school. I would call that a positive. I would call that a positive consequence of an instance of identity capitalism. The reason that I picked the term identity capitalism is not because this is about capitalism, literally, right? This is not about Karl Marx. Capitalism is a heuristic. And I really wanted to capture the idea that in what I've used the most pernicious examples of identity capitalism, the in-group is benefiting in a way that doesn't include the out-group potentially at all. So, in some of these far spectrum instances of identity capitalism, the out-group is not capturing or is not internalizing any of the benefits that the in-group is gaining from its identity. And so that I think, at one end of the spectrum, we could point to examples where an individual or an institution is using an out-group member in a way that doesn't benefit the out-group member at all, like the individual or the institution that's using out-group identity is just benefiting itself, not helping the in-group, not helping the out-group member at all. And then there certainly are some shades of gray short of that. And I think that with respect to those shades of gray, the question is not so much, is it identity capitalism or is it not identity capitalism? But rather, since it is identity capitalism, what do we do with that? And I think that those of us who are involved in work on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion need to be engaging with these issues and constantly re-examining our practices and thinking about, okay, like who is this actually who is this actually benefiting? Is this benefiting mostly the institution, or is the out-group member who's being conscripted in this way, are they also benefiting?
I love that. And that's a really interesting answer, because I skipped over a question that I had down of like, what's the harm of identity capitalism? Because I thought you'd already kind of answered it, right, in your response and with your examples. And I thought everyone in the audience would be like, well, of course, right? The harm is it's a kind of commoditization of a human being, right? So, when you said, that, and I've been, so you don't feel like I'm singling you out here, like I've been or suspected that I've been in exactly the situation that you've described at your wedding many, many times in my own life, and expect many racial and other minorities feel that way as well, right? But there, it seems pretty obvious that the harm, especially when you say I was just part of the color scheme, right, is that you're treating a human being as if they're an object. So it's a kind of commoditization, an anti-commoditization argument, right? But then what you just said was really fascinating, because you said it's not that you're against sort of capitalism or identity per se, it's that you're against the forms of capitalism that don't redound to the benefit of the outsiders, right? So this is more of a kind of expropriation, right, of property, right, notion, right? And both, of course, could be in play. You could both object to someone being treated as property, and then you could say, assuming that someone is going to be treated as property, they could at least get some benefit from being treated that way. So in order to like test those intuitions, can we talk about President Biden's promise that his Supreme Court nominee would be a Black woman, right? Because there I would say, one could argue that that's a kind of commoditization or of identity that, Ketanji Brown Jackson is, I know her a little bit. She's an extraordinary human being and jurist. She would be great in any pool. There's part of me that's sad that she, gets to the Supreme Court on this premise rather than through an open field of competition in which I feel like she could completely prevail, right? But, on the other hand, like maybe this is what needed to get done in order for her to be able to overcome these intersectional effects of bias against both on the basis of both race and gender. So there's an instance in which she's arguably being commoditized, or identity is being commoditized, but the community, the Black community, the community of women, community of people of color like myself, all benefit, right? So it allows us to kind of assess which is doing more work. What do you think?
Well, I think they're both doing. I think they're both doing some work. With respect to identity capitalism, I think my starting point is that we would be living in a better society if identity capitalism didn't happen. So in that sense, identity capitalism is always bad, because there is always something commodifying about it. But then, there's the separate question of, since we do live in a society where there are incentives for identity capitalism, like what do we make of it when it does happen, as it, I would say, inevitably does right now? And, I shared your mixed reactions to the way that Judge Jackson's nomination was framed. I think there's no question that President Biden's framing of this issue was an act of identity capitalism. He was trying to reap the benefit, not only of nominating a Black woman, but also of saying my nominee will be a Black woman, right? Which I think that we could look at in some senses trying to get credit in two different ways, or maybe trying to express not only his willingness to nominate a Black woman, but his maybe greater commitment to even not consider nominating anyone other than a Black woman. So I think that I think that the identity capitalism framework is accurately descriptive of what happened here. But as you point out, there are so many benefits to her being on the Supreme Court, that if this was the way that it had to happen, then I think that many of us would agree that it was better for it to happen this way than not to happen at all. Mm-hmm. And so this is often the struggle that I have with instances of what I would identify as identity capitalism, is that it might not have happened at all if there wasn't this benefit to the in-group member. right? And so since it did happen in this particular way, was it better for it to happen in this particular way, or was it better for it not to happen? I mean, I think with respect to this example, I'm comfortable saying that it was better for it to happen this way than not to happen at all. Now, not every act of identity capitalism is going to have these ripple effects, these very profound ripple effects for outgroup members, the way that Judge, perhaps soon Justice Jackson's nomination will. And for these millions of other far less public instances of identity capitalism, I think that the calculus could be a lot more complicated.
Great. And I have to say here too that this is not something that only the left engages in, right? So, I mean, again, to your point, Professor Leong, that we're all identity capitalists. Let's remember that President Trump said that he would fill Ruth Bader Ginsburg's position with a woman, and so that's its own form of identity capitalism as well. What you just said, though, in a slightly more hopefully profound vein, right, than I just did, and saying this is bipartisan, because I always get so irritated when people think that identity capitalism or these D&I concerns are the special perquisite of the left rather than something that both sides engage in. But to sound a kind of higher register, let me say that I'm a little bit calmer now. I'm relieved. So you've reassured me, because as I hear you, and tell me if I'm right to feel a bit reassured, it's really about time horizon, like when these harms kick in. So if we're talking about the commodification of individuals, you say in your book that in a world that was truly and authentically diverse, we would have no need for identity capitalism. So I hear in that if we think about this is what my dean, Trevor Morrison, likes to call the utopian solution and the in the meantime solution, right? The utopian solution is we're authentically diverse, and so nobody needs to commodify their identity in this way. And we're not there, right? So in a world of we're not there, then what are the in the meantime strategies for dealing with the fact that we all have to engage in forms of identity capitalism? And we should always, as you say, reflect on this, but we can have some kind of parameters of when it's a good thing and when it's less of a good thing, right? Or when it's not a good thing, I guess should be the presumption. But when we can overcome that presumption with other goods that we're putting on the table, right? And whether it actually truly benefits the outgroup rather than simply being an appropriation of the outgroup's identity for the sole interest of the in-group might be one metric. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization, and also to recognize that some of these instances of identity capitalism are iterative, or it's not as though the consequences are fixed. So I don't think that we can necessarily put the instance of identity capitalism and take it and look at it on the slide under the microscope and just say this was good or this was bad in what percentage. I mean, I think that we could look at any instance of identity capitalism and say this was identity capitalism, but how can we manage the consequences of this so that the outgroup is capturing more of the benefits that the in-group is capturing? And so if we could maybe for a moment go back to the example of the photos in every college's admissions brochure, to the extent that a college is putting photos of its students of color in its admissions brochures without following up at all with respect to the students of color, to see how they're doing, right? Like, are they thriving in their environment? Are they happy? Do they feel belonging? To the extent that the school is not following up with those students at all, that's something that can change. And I would even go so far as to say that to the extent that the school is doing something like using its students of color for recruitment purposes, but not for any other purpose, there might be a way to frame that in a way that actually benefits the students of color. So perhaps students of color who are asked even to do things like meet with admitted students or appear in photographs. Maybe they could have their books paid for the next semester. I'm just throwing out an idea. But so I think what I want to say is that I like to encourage I like to encourage a continued focus on whether and to what extent the outgroup is benefiting and what the in-group can do to ensure that the outgroup actually is part of the calculus in determining how these acts of identity capitalism ultimately play out.
I love that. And this is going to sound like horrible virtue signaling, but I actually say it, with the hope that other institutions will embrace it as well. I was so tired of being asked to do D&I work as a kind of service, right, to the school, for which was totally uncompensated, that when I became the director of the center, we vowed, my executive director, David Glasgow, and I, that no one would ever do any work for the center on D&I without getting compensated. So we either pay them, the student volunteers and fellows who work for us, or we give them academic credit. And I think this is a really good model, right? Many organizations that we work with say, I'm being asked to do all this service, and it's totally uncompensated. One answer, right, for the organizations is either not to do it, right, or to do it in the meantime world that we're living in, but to make sure that some real compensation flows to those individuals, whether it counts as a fraction of a billable hour or whether there's actual financial remuneration on the table. Okay, so I now want to sort of pivot a little bit and leave the in-groups aside for a minute, because I think one of the fascinating things in your book, and I would never have thought of this, so I thought this was really brilliant, is you sort of say, let's look at the outgroup as well, and the incentives on the outgroup to engage in identity capitalism. So you call this identity entrepreneurship. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and give us an example or two?
Sure. So what I call identity entrepreneurship involves a situation where a member of the outgroup is leveraging their outgroup identity to benefit themselves. And I want to point out that identity entrepreneurship presupposes or depends on a background system of identity capitalism. So the reason that there is the reason that there is an opportunity for somebody to engage in identity entrepreneurship in the first place is because there is a certain form of value placed on outgroup identity by the in-group. And so it's an opportunity for an outgroup member to engage in leveraging their identity or making their identity salient to or available to the in-group for some kind of benefit to the individual outgroup member. And it could be a social benefit, an economic benefit, a political benefit, some other kind of benefit. And I'd be happy to give a couple of examples. I think that many of the audience members today are probably law students or law school graduates. And so a small act of identity entrepreneurship could involve something like, if you're a member of an outgroup, whether on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity or race, and let's say that as a member of this outgroup, you were applying to law school, and the law school you're applying to gave you the opportunity to write a personal statement. And you chose to write your personal statement about your outgroup identity membership and perhaps how it had affected your life or how it had affected your decision to go to law school. I would call that a small act of identity entrepreneurship. And I think this would be particularly so the more the school seems to value, or the more the school, the more your outgroup identity membership category seems to be in demand by the school. And so this would maybe depend from one institution to the next. But I think that writing a personal statement about one's outgroup identity membership, that's an act of identity entrepreneurship. And I am picking this example because I hope that this will make this personal in some sense to many who are part of the conversation today. In the spirit of continuing with examples in which I fess up to being involved in identity capitalism or identity entrepreneurship, I thought perhaps I'd mention that when this was not yet a book, when it didn't look like this, it just looked like a PDF file that I was sending to different publishers. It wasn't even a file of the whole book yet. It was just a few chapters in a proposal. Well, in a proposal, for those of you who haven't written one thing you often talk about is who you are and what qualifies you to write this book. And You can bet that I made my identity salient in talking about why I was qualified to write this book. I talked about how I am the first Asian American woman to hold the rank of full professor at the University of Denver. I talked about how I personally had been involved in both identity capitalism and identity entrepreneurship. And I think I would go so far as to say that some of the ways in which I talked about myself and my experiences in my book proposal framed the book in a way that made it more appealing than if it was written by a straight, white, wealthy, able-bodied man. And so those are a couple examples of identity entrepreneurship. Are those helpful as a starting point?
Incredibly helpful. I of course have some follow-ups, and one of them is,
Yeah.
How are we supposed to feel about identity entrepreneurship, right? Because those examples both seem totally innocuous to me, but I get the sense that you want us to reflect and be careful about identity entrepreneurship as well. I don't think you condemn it as much as you condemn identity capitalism when conducted by in-group members, right? But I think that you ask us to hit pause on it. I would say in your instance, like, I genuinely do think that your background, your identity sort of enriched the book. So on your grounds of authenticity being one of the touchstones of when we shouldn't have to worry about this as much, like, I think you have that. But let's look at more kind of unsavory examples, right? So I think that, and I don't want to blame the victim here, but I can easily imagine individuals like, my identity really isn't that important to me. So I could imagine, this wasn't me, but I could imagine like applying to law school saying my gay identity has nothing to do with who I am, right? But I know what the market wants, right? And so I'm going to give the market what it wants, because that's going to, and I wouldn't beat myself up or beat anyone else up for that, because what's at fault, as you say, is the market that requires this rather than the person who makes the decision. But if we take another step beyond that, we see individuals like pretty, whether that's diamond and silk, Black women, right, who know that they have a particular niche because they are, Trump supporters, and, a community that has very few, a Black community has very few Trump supporters, or, I may, this may be a more controversial example, or maybe less, I don't know, but shows like Queer Eye, that sort of, individuals are sort of capitalizing on positive stereotypes about, gay male identity that many gay men, including myself, are sort of ambivalent about. It's like, I'm not really sure that I want, that to be reinforced as something that we should celebrate in the culture, and that I think gay people should be able to be slobs just like everybody else, right? So, can you help me with that? I mean, am I right to intuit that in this book you're kind of gentler on identity entrepreneurship? And then if I give you that spectrum of examples, am I right to say it's a kind of sliding scale of discomfort?
I think that I think that you are absolutely right that I'm gentler on identity capitalism, because the thing is, identity capitalists didn't invent the system. These are outgroup members who didn't invent and don't control the system of identity capitalism that is larger than all of us and precedes all of us. And I would also add to that outgroup members are, by definition, less empowered to change the system than are members of in-groups. So, I view identity entrepreneurship more, I would say, equivocally than I do identity capitalism. Identity capitalism, my takeaway is, well, it would be better if this wasn't happening. So I am a gentler on identity entrepreneurship. I think that identity entrepreneurship can become problematic in a number of ways. One that I focus on is the situation where a member of an outgroup engages in identity entrepreneurship. They leverage their outgroup they leverage their outgroup identity, but in a way that disadvantages the outgroup as a whole. Perhaps by reinforcing undesirable stereotypes, perhaps by promoting causes, right? Perhaps political causes that disadvantage the outgroup as a whole. So to make the example maybe a little bit more concrete, you mentioned Diamond and Silk, who people perhaps can Google after the webinar. I would describe Diamond and Silk as two, I would call them political commentators and entertainers who have made a career out of being Black women who are willing to say things that Donald Trump supporters agree with. I think that's probably Diamond and Silk in about a sentence. And the difficulty with Diamond and Silk is that, first of all, the way that they perform identity, I think, reinforces stereotypes that many Donald Trump supporters may already hold about Black women. Like these are performances of identity that are highly stereotypical, and these may, particularly for members of constituencies that are not very familiar with Black women, that may not know any Black women closely. These reinforce stereotypes about what Black women believe and how Black women generally tend to act. I mean, I think another consequence, which is a little bit more attenuated with respect to a political commentator, but I think that Diamond and Silk provide cover to supporters of Donald Trump, and maybe in some instances, the Republican Party more generally, since we're being bipartisan in terms of talking about identity capitalism and identity entrepreneurship. I think that they provide some cover. I know that at more than one rally during the 2020 presidential campaign, Donald Trump refuted the claim that he doesn't have any Black supporters, in part by pointing to Diamond and Silk, as well as some of his other Black supporters. And this is, setting aside the fact that his actual electoral support, I think, is 8% for Black people overall and maybe 4% for Black women. It's very, very low. So there's a way in which Diamond and Silk are providing, I would call it cover, or maybe even window dressing for the Trump campaign, even though the campaign has been accused of racism and even more recently of white supremacy. So I think that's one key harm of identity entrepreneurship, is when it actually starts to either cover for behavior that's disadvantageous to the outgroup, or it actually facilitates conduct that is harmful to the outgroup itself.
Great. I want to put on our law professor hats now, or at least put mine on, and say, one of the things that's such a pleasure is to talk to somebody who actually is a law professor, because many of the people we invite to the seminar, as amazing as they are not, of our tribe. So to ask a legal question, one of the things that you say is that, the law doesn't do that well, right, in many aspects. And so identity capitalism can be offered as a critique. So and you can pick either or both of these, but one area is the diversity rationale for affirmative action, which you critique on identity capitalism grounds. And the other one is just anti-discrimination law more generally, having real issues with identity capitalism. So would love your take on either of those legal critiques.
Yeah, why don't I say a few words about affirmative action, since it's on everybody's mind right now, what with Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard. So for anyone who may need a quick refresher, the diversity has been the only rationale by which a university can constitutionally justify a race-conscious affirmative action program since a case called Bakke versus Regents of the University of California that was decided in 1978. And so, you really can't fault colleges and universities for putting a lot of priority on diversity, given that that's the only way, that justification is the only way that they can keep in place a race-conscious, a race-conscious affirmative action program. Having said that, I do worry and see evidence that the emphasis on diversity in some instances comes at the expense of more substantive conversations about equity and inclusion and belonging within institutions. So to make that a little bit more concrete, many law schools, I know mine is guilty of this at times, are very focused on the numbers and faces, right? Like what percentage of students qualify as members of one or another historically marginalized groups. And, do we have enough photos to put in our promotional materials? When really, not that those questions are not important. I'm not saying that diversity isn't important, but my concern is that the laser focus on those questions sometimes sidelines other questions about, for example, how are students of color or students who are members of other marginalized groups actually doing within an institution? How are their grades? How are their levels of anxiety and depression compared with other students? At a law school, how do the bar passage rates look? How do the postgraduate employment rates look, right? Like these more substantive questions about the well-being of the members of the group. And I worry that these questions about well-being and substantive outcomes are being displaced by the focus on diversity, or as I sometimes shorthand it, the focus on faces and numbers. Yeah. And so the one other thing I would say is that for anyone here who might be interested in reading more, there's a really terrific essay written by Professor Derek Bell of NYU Law School and one of the fathers of critical race theory. The essay is called Diversity's Distractions, and it was published in the Columbia Law Review as part of a symposium on the University of Michigan affirmative action cases in 2003. And it really picks up on this idea that diversity, while not a bad thing, is also not the end goal. We might think of it as a means towards an end rather than the end in itself.
Right. And if we were to truly embrace the remediation rationale, right, we would be able to make real progress on the subordination that, again, to your theory, would make this kind of identity capitalism defunct or unnecessary. It might be one way of looking at it. All right, we're going to pivot now to questions because we have a very long queue. I could do this all day, Professor Leong. I have a ton more questions. It's a fascinating book. Highly recommend that everybody read it. But I'm going to pivot now to questions. The first one is, could you address whether performative statements of anti-racism by in-groups, such as BLM signs on the lawns of affluent white neighborhoods, fits conceptually as a form of identity capitalism?
Yes, so I think that this is certainly a form of identity capitalism, as are many of these forms of signaling. We can think about lawn signs and bumper stickers and hashtags in people's Twitter biographies and putting things on social media. And so I think that these are a form of identity capitalism in the sense that the person who is making this display is benefiting themselves by reference to outgroup identity. How troubling this is, in my mind at least, depends on what else the person who is putting on this performance is doing. Like, are they donating money to any of these causes about which they purport to feel so strongly? Like, how do they treat their coworkers of color, for example, or their coworkers of other marginalized groups? So the problem is not the lawn signs and the bumper stickers per se. It's if people have those signaling devices, but they're not doing anything substantive to back them up.
Great. And this is very much in the same vein. The second question is very kind of plain-throated in a way I admire. In the end, isn't the proof of whether something is good or bad in the numbers? If they, I think meaning identity capitalisms, genuinely increase the diversity of their institutions over time, then what they did was good. If they don't increase the numbers, then it's exploitative.
So I'm not sure about that. I would want to think about that a little bit more for the following reason. You can imagine a law school or any institution really that has pretty good looking numbers on diversity, like say an institution that's maybe, I don't know, 40%, we'll stick with race for the time being. Imagine a law school that's 40% people of color. But if the people of color in that law school are not thriving, like if some of the outcomes that I mentioned a moment ago are outcomes on which the people of color within that institution are still lagging their white counterparts, then I'm not sure that we can really say whether the institution's acts of identity capitalism have been good or bad. I mean, I think that we might be able to start making an inference about it, but you could imagine a law school that looks really good on paper, like the numbers look really good, and say that you go down to the student union and you point a camera in any direction and you can get beautiful, diverse photos for the website. That doesn't necessarily mean that this is actually a good place for members of communities of color and other marginalized groups. Excuse me. Right. So I think that's where I would start with on that analysis.
Great. And this is this follows. So if this is if you've already answered this, feel free to say you have. But when companies talk about DEI, what are the key signals to look out for to distinguish identity capitalism from authentic efforts to level the playing field in terms of gender, race, and other underrepresented cohorts of the population?
Well, I mean, I think that this is a similar question in some ways, but it gives me an opportunity to say something that I wanted to mention in response to one of your questions before, and I forgot about, which is that I think that the faces and numbers focus is actually not the kind of information that we should be focusing on or seeking out from institutions ranging from educational institutions to companies. I think, for example, that rather than the faces and numbers information about Walmart, it would be more interesting to know things like average salary at each tier, what the diversity numbers look like at each tier and whether there is attrition. With respect to a lot of law firms, I would be really interested in knowing not just their overall diversity statistics, but statistics like how many years from first hire to partnership for different subcategories of identity, for white people versus non-white people, or men versus women and non-men. Those are the pieces of information that I think are more telling with respect to substantive goals related to equality, as opposed to just the numbers.
Mm-hmm. Great. I love this one too, this next one, because it touches on a conversation that we were having. So I think it grants a premise that in a utopian society, we wouldn't need to we engage in identity capitalism. But the question says, quote, in a utopian society, we could practice pure meritocracy. How do we know when we reach the point where we don't have to make someone's identity an issue? Close quote.
That's such a terrific question. And I think this question is hard because I don't know. It's hard to imagine from here how we get to the utopian society, which doesn't mean that it shouldn't be the goal. It's just hard to see from this. It's kind of like, when you're hiking and you know that it's a very long hike and you can't see the top of the mountain. That doesn't mean that you stop hiking, but it's still hard to imagine. So the question, how do we know? How do we know when we get there? I think that we can look at some of the substantive equality metrics that I mentioned earlier, and I think that they would look roughly the same across identity categories, with some reasonable variation from year to year, for example. I think perhaps another way that we would know we were there is that people no longer felt compelled to engage in identity capitalism because they wouldn't feel that they had that to prove anymore. I mean, if each of us had an organically diverse friend group, people wouldn't feel the need to showcase their Black friends or their Asian American friends or whatever category of friends. So perhaps identity capitalism itself could be one metric by how we know when we get to utopia, we don't need it anymore. Or nobody has the urge to engage in it anymore.
Yeah, I had that intuition as well of just feeling like if this really is a market, then if the demand dries up, then the supply will wither as well. Yeah. So here's another one. Does identity capitalism also affirmatively enable continued oppression by celebrating a certain type of outgroup member that's acceptable to the in-group?
Yeah, I love this question. And so I think the answer is yes. And this ties together, I really appreciate this question because it ties together the concepts of identity capitalism and identity entrepreneurship. So another problem with identity entrepreneurship, in addition to some of the problems that I mentioned earlier, is that it really gives in-group members a stake in out-group identity performance, and it gives members of outgroups an incentive to perform outgroup identity in a way that the in-group approves of. And so, for example, if we think about, I mentioned law firms earlier. So if we think about law firms, and if we think about being a member of a marginalized group at a law firm, let's say that you're a woman of color. The way that you dress, and let's say the way that you style your hair or the clothes that you wear, the incentives that you have for the choices that you make about how you display your identity on a day-to-day basis are going to be deeply influenced by what the in-group approves of. And so my guess is that if you are at a predominantly white, predominantly male law firm, I would guess that that law firm is going to be spending some time capitalizing on your identity, right? I would guess that you're going to be in a lot of the photos, and that you're going to be asked to identify potential new associates, that you're going to be asked to do a lot of these things that really boil down to identity capitalism by the law firm. The extent to which the law firm continues to value your outgroup identity will probably depend on whether you are performing that outgroup identity in a way that the law firm believes represents its interests. And so let's say that you are, we'll say, an Indian American woman, and if left to your own devices, you would like to wear traditional dress. You might like to wear a sari or something like that. But the law firm might not approve of that. And so you're faced with this choice and this knowledge that in order to be of value to this identity capitalist law firm, you're going to have to continue to make choices about your dress and other aspects of your appearance in a way that the law firm approves of. And so I think that this is yet another difficulty with identity entrepreneurship and how it fits into the system of identity capitalism more generally.
Yep. And I love this next question because it follows directly on that, but it also is a really ingenious twist that I hadn't thought of at all. So thank you, whoever asked this. I'm thinking about the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association's recent rule change that allows college athletes to be paid for commercial use of their name, image, likeness, NIL. Wondering what you think about extending this framework to the widespread use of racially underrepresented students' photos in admissions brochures, et cetera. What about compensation for employees' NIL usage in the workplace context?
So I think that's a terrific idea. I think that's a terrific idea. I think that we would have to think about how that was implemented in practice. But going back to the point that I made earlier about how one of the metrics for evaluating identity capitalism is to what extent the outgroup member is also capturing some of the benefits. I think that this would be one way that we could ensure that the outgroup captures some additional benefits, and that those benefits, moreover, would be left within the discretion of the outgroup member, right? That those additional benefits would enhance the autonomy of the outgroup member to if it's money, right, to decide how that money is spent. If it's something else, maybe some kind of status within the institution, to to think about how that status and whatever power comes with that status is used. So I would be in favor of that, of course, with the understanding that like implementation questions are always difficult with respect to with that.
So we have 4 minutes left. I'm going to use my moderator's prerogative to return to one of my questions as a kind of finale, because I think that one of the many things I admire about this book, which again is Identity Capitalists, is that you kind of discipline yourself to provide solutions, right? So you offer 4 principles as guideposts for kind of understanding whether we're moving forward or not. And those 4 are honesty, apology, education, and authenticity. So could you talk us through, time permitting, sort of as many of those as you care to, I should put it like that, and leave us on this moment of hope, and those who want more can actually delve into the book.
Yeah, so if it's all right, I'd like to focus a little bit on honesty, because I think that one is a prerequisite for the other 3. And by honesty, I just mean being more transparent about what is actually happening, as opposed to trying to use identity capitalism as a band-aid solution. So, for example, and to make this concrete, if an educational institution is trying to include additional photos of non-white people in its materials as a way of enhancing the diversity of future classes, then I wish that educational institution would just say that the educational institution would just come out and say, we have a ways to go when it comes to diversity, right? Like right now, only 10% of our student body is not white. And we know that we have a way to go, but we are taking these concrete steps. We're allocating these resources. We're doing this to support our students of color within our community. I would prefer to see that rather than just framing the numbers in kind of the most self-aggrandizing way possible, and including some nice diverse photos. As to the other points, I think that apology is an important aspect of addressing identity capitalism, because a lot of the time identity capitalism is something that happens when people don't want to apologize. Like, rather than apologizing for the racist thing that they said, like they point to their Black friends. Education, like conversations, the one that we're having today, causes us to think about why we want to engage in identity capitalism, as opposed to just kind of reflexively engaging in identity capitalism. And then authenticity ties back into honesty and the kind of this broader conversation about how it's important for institutions not to misrepresent themselves and their goals, and how we can have better conversations if institutions are more forthright about what they're trying to accomplish, rather than giving into the impulse of identity capitalism.
Fantastic. Professor Nancy Leong, thank you so much for joining us today, and particularly for letting us end on that constructive note of hope. Again, for everybody, the book is Identity Capitalists. It just came out a short while ago, The Powerful Insiders Who Exploit Diversity to Maintain Inequality. Highly recommend it. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was truly a pleasure.
And we are adjourned. This is our last speaker series session for this academic year, and we look forward to continuing the conversation next fall. Until then, be well.